It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to all of you Professor Sue Hopewell, a new member of the School of Education faculty this fall, but she's been around for a while. She completed her doctorate at CU Boulder last spring. She has long been a teacher in Boulder Valley schools and worked with teachers across Denver public schools. She's an extraordinary resource. We're delighted she's a part of our faculty and so appreciate her taking time today to work with all of us to think through some key features of academic language and how those play out in the work that you're all going to be doing in the TPA. This is going to be an interactive session, which is why you're seated in round tables facing one another. She'll be doing a balance of presentation and table talk, and there'll be a chance for you to stop and get your questions answered. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Sue. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good afternoon. So I watched you all walk in today, I got really excited. I remember student teaching, I remember how exciting it is. And it's hard, it's very hard, but it's also the students I still think about today and wonder where they are were the kids I spent that student teaching semester with. So you'll fall in love with your kids, it's going to be fabulous. So what I'm hoping today is that a lot of what we go over will be a form of review, but that it will expand a little bit on what you learned while you were in the teacher preparation program at CU. And so you all know you have to do the TPA, and that a piece of that is talking about academic language, and yet probably that term wasn't used much in your coursework as you went through the program. I assure you, you talked about academic language. You talked about the types of language we need to focus on, but maybe not in the terms that the TPA is looking for. So part of what I want to do today is call your attention to what it is I think you'll need to be thinking about. So the first thing I want to do is put up a quote by Jeff Swires. This is a name, actually, I don't think this slide is in your packet, and you may want to write down his name. He's got some very good books that have to do with developing academic language, and especially academic language in the content areas at secondary. So if you're a secondary teacher, this is a person you'll want to know. I think a lot of times when we talk about academic language, we think only about vocabulary, and that's why I wanted to kick off with this, because it's so much more. Dr. Swires tells us words are just the tip of the iceberg. Millions of bright and capable students around the world struggle in school and even give up because they lack the abilities to use language in ways that are expected in academic settings. It's how we're using language, not just what language we're using. When, where, and for what purposes. So really briefly, what academic language is and is not, in my view. Academic language is discipline-specific language. That's, I think, what we think of first. Words like photosynthesis. But it's so much more than that. It's the language of text, both receptive and productive. So what do I mean by that? Receptive text is text that we read or take in, and productive text is text we produce. So it's reading and writing, the text of both. How do we express ourselves in writing? How do we take in what it is we're reading? It's the language of assessment. When we ask children to perform tasks, how do they understand what we've asked them to do? That's academic language. It's the language you need to be successful in school. It's the language of our instructions when we ask children to participate. So not just what we can take out of text, but what language are we orally using that we need to make sure that kids understand. It is connected discourse. It's not short bursts of language. So extended, reasoned, logical, precise, connected discourse. I'm going to show you some examples of writing later today that are not as connected as we like to see in academic language, and have you take a shot at turning it into academic language and looking at what's the difference. And it's more than just providing a definition. Knowing what a word means doesn't matter as much as being able to use it appropriately. And that is more complicated sometimes than we think. What is it not? It is not code for ESL. I'm very worried right now that when we talk about academic language, we keep talking about it as if it is the language of kids whose first language is not English, as if everyone in school doesn't need academic language to be successful. You do need to take these children into consideration, children. They are not the only children. You will be looking at when you're doing the TPA and saying, I have kids at these levels and of these native language backgrounds. You will note both the native English speakers and those who are not native English speakers. Oh, the other thing I meant to invite you to do is stop me at any moment, especially supervisors. You probably have a better sense of this. When you feel like there's a moment when you'd like a minute to process with your table, if I haven't given you that minute, please raise your hand and say, we want to talk through that for a minute, okay? I'm very open to questions on the spot. It is not exclusive to school and the workplace, although that's how we tend to define it. A lot of the words that you need to be successful in school, you use inside and outside of school. To pretend that we don't talk in cause and effect outside of school is a farce. So to say that it's only for there is inaccurate. It's not only content-specific vocabulary, it's very common vocabulary. You need a whole lot of common words and common structures to be successful academically. And it's not learned through mere exposure. If it were, we'd all have it. You need practice and an opportunity to apply and feedback. And it's not language taught in isolation. We all know that. Nothing in school should be taught in isolation. So, to give you a sense as you're planning of some things you may want to be thinking about as you look across your kids in your classroom. That if you think about what kids know in terms of the language they know and the concept you need to teach. If you go to this third column, you see where your emphasis may need to be. So if you have a child who doesn't know the language and doesn't know the concept, you've got to really work hard there, right? You're teaching two things, and there's neither one you can build on very well. If you're lucky, you're in this B, C, or D range, right? You've got a child who knows the language but doesn't know the concept. So what you need to develop is concept, but you've got language to build on. In C, you see unknown language, known concept. You need language development. If a child already has a concept, no matter what language they know it in, you don't need to reteach the concept. I know respiratory system inside out and backwards in English, probably in Spanish as well. If I were taking it in Chinese, I'd need the language. I don't need to learn about the respiratory system. And finally, you've got kids who know both, but you just need to go deeper in mastery. Any questions on that? Because as you're thinking about your planning in your classrooms, you need to know your kids this well. What concepts do they know? What language do they know? And how are you going to get at both? But here's the challenge. It's not always obvious to teachers and administrators what language to focus on. So it's really easy to pick out the big words or the content-specific words. Words that, like on this slide, motif, contrived, assonance. These words are the easy ones to pick out. They're not always the ones kids need to know. So I'm going to show you some examples. And the first one comes literally from me teaching. So when I was a teacher in Boulder Valley School, I asked some kids, we spent a whole lot of time learning about legends and what legends do and how we express ourselves when we're doing legends. And I modeled it for them, we did them together, all of the gradual release of responsibility. And finally for homework, when I really thought they had it, I asked them to go home independently and write a legend explaining shooting stars. This is what I expected. This is what I got. Never underestimate the language challenges of students. They can misinterpret what you mean in ways that you sometimes have trouble seeing. Yes, I got an entire essay on Michael Jordan. It took me half a second to figure it out. Here's another one. Now this one you may have seen. Commonly out there. But how are kids going to misinterpret what we say? Find X. This child has done exactly what's been asked of him or her. Right? Here's another one. Illustrate using a stem and leaf diagram. Picture of a flower pointing to the stem and the leaf with a question mark, yes. Getting in the habit of rethinking how kids might interpret what it is you're saying is part of your task right now, and it's not easy. My final example is this one. Where was the American Declaration of Independence signed? At the bottom. Perfectly reasonable answer. Not academic, not what we were looking for, and really it's a lot our fault because we haven't thought it through. One of my favorite CSAP answers when I used to give the CSAP was, There was a writing prompt that was, write about your favorite season and why. And we had a child write about chili. I like chili, my mother makes it this way, she puts it in these recipes. Like, that is a season. It's not winter, fall, spring, or what am I missing? Winter, fall, spring, or summer, but it is a season. It's another way of interpreting the same word. So I'm going to have you do an activity really quickly at your tables together. I've got 5 words I want you to define. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds each to define them. And I'm just going to put them up one at a time so you're really focused. The first word is kingdom. Take 30 seconds or so, write a definition for the word kingdom. Second word, table. Third word, round. Fourth word, power. And fifth word, energy. Before we go on, I want to get a couple of you to share what you've written. Kingdom. Who wants to share the definition for a kingdom? Back of the room. An area ruled by a royal monarch. Okay. A table. Definition for a table. Back of the room again. Gentlemen at the back of the room.
A chart where we store data.
I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
A chart where we store data.
A chart where we store data. Oh, did you see some people go, oh, yeah. What about round? Go ahead, come on. I heard the one in the front. I wanted you to share.
The type of song where one person starts and
Type of song where one person starts and another joins in. We sing in rounds. Power.
I squared R.
I squared R. Power. What about energy? All of these words are used in many different contexts. And it might be easy to know kingdom, table, round, power, etc. in terms of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table. But what happens when they show up in science and math? Some of you went there right away, and some of you didn't. These are the kinds of words that are going to trip kids up. They have specific uses in specific contexts that are really different from how they're used commonly. I highlighted just the ones in red, which was the ones I asked you about. But look at table. Table gets even more complicated. So there are the two kinds of table, a concrete table as in the one you're sitting at. There's a table in terms of how we arrange data, as was shared at the back of the room. But we have idiomatic expressions. It's all on the table. They turned the tables on. They drank themselves under the table. Nouns versus verb, a periodic table versus table, a discussion. You can be reading something and think you know all the words and still not have any idea what it is that's being communicated. I want you to take a minute at your tables, talk about what the implications of that are in your setting right now, where you're student teaching. Were there any tables where you had nothing to share? So I'm not telling you a lot of what you don't know. What I'm hoping is that I'll help you to just keep looking much more carefully as you're teaching at what you need to attend to and how you need to be more explicit in your teaching. So what elements of language do you need to be thinking about? Well, there are a number of levels that I think are important every day in every classroom, in every content area. You need to be thinking about discourse. How are sentences combined for extended communication? How do we take turns? How do we ask permission to do things? What registers are appropriate in what context? We often don't say what we mean. So when I teach second language acquisition, one of my favorite examples occurred one summer when I was teaching, and that was, because I teach second language acquisition, I spend a lot of time paying attention to how I talk. And one evening, one summer while teaching this course, I was driving in the car, and I said, the air conditioner's on. Now, my husband's not a moron, right? He knew the air conditioning was on. What I was saying was roll up the window, right? Did I use those words? No, we do that all the time. Those are discourse kinds of things where we say one thing, I'm waiting. I like the way so-and-so is sitting. We're not saying exactly what it is we want. We're communicating something, but it may not be what children are hearing. We need to be explicit about what those things mean and attend to what we are saying. Sociolinguistics. Who says what to whom for what purposes? Who do you have permission to talk to? Who do you have permission to call by first name versus last name? Those are unspoken rules of language that need to be made more explicit. What varieties and dialects of language are more appropriate in school than others? And that's not to belittle anyone's dialect. It's to say we need to add to the registers that our students have. What they bring is beautiful and perfect for the communities they come from. But in school, we need to add a register that all children need. Grammar. How does language work? What are the rules? What's the syntax? What's the morphology? Morphology being that smallest unit that makes meaning. If you know that you have to add an S on a third person singular verb, he likes to go to the store, it's important to point that out to kids who aren't yet using it. Vocabulary, we spend a lot of time on vocabulary, so I'm not going to spend more time. You know that's words and semantics, that's what carries the meaning. And phonology, those are the sounds we put together to make words. We need to teach kids the difference between the emphasis in manipulate and manipulation. They look a lot alike, they're not said the same way. Questions on this? Okay. So here's the thing, for all this talk and all this we have to attend to vocabulary, I find this research fascinating, and I really want to spend a minute with you so that you see that you don't have to cover everything. So this is research by Paul Nation, he's out of Australia, and I'm going to move away from the mic. I'm pretty sure I have a good enough teaching voice that you can hear me at the back of the room. Can you hear me, Jenny? Good. Okay, so here's the thing. He did textual analysis of books used in the English language and found that, and taught, that if you only look at the first 1,000 most frequently used words, you can understand 84% of words used in conversation, day-to-day conversation. Another 82% of all fiction that you read, 75% of English language newspapers, and almost 74% of college-level text. That's only the first 1,000 words. That's a, the, of, would, could, should, might, right? Color words. If you add the second 1,000 most frequent words, you'll find that you can understand 90% of what's said, right? It's the 84 plus the 6%. 90% of what's said is comprised of the first 2,000 most frequently used words. 87% of fiction, another 80% of newspapers, and nearly 80% of what's in college-level text. Abram Coxhead also did an analysis of college-level text across disciplines and looked for the most common words that aren't in those first 2,000 words. Came up with a list of 570 words. If you add those 570 words to those first 2,000, you'll find that all but 7.8% of what we say can be accounted for. 92% of the words. So we're talking about under 3,000 words and being able to understand over 90% of what we hear in a day-to-day conversation. About 90% of what we read in fiction. Another 85% or so of what we read in newspapers. And 87% of what we read in college-level text. It makes it much less intimidating to think about what kinds of words we need to pick out and teach when we realize that there's some really high utility words. What I've given you at your tables so that you have them are the second 1,000 words and, toward the back, the academic words. Go ahead and take a look at those for a minute and tell me what stands out for you, especially as the academic words in the academic word list. They are written in italics, so the last page.
We're going to worry about now. That'll work. Sorry. I was like, well, I don't know the word.
Thank you so much. Oh, perfect. Okay. Observations. What do you notice about these words? Jenny? Latin roots. Latin roots. Lots of Latin and Greek roots. So if we are teaching prefixes and suffixes and how to make sense of words, we give kids strategies. What else? Elementary school teachers. How many of you are elementary? Just out of curiosity. How many of you found words on the academic word list? These came from college level texts that you could be reinforcing in elementary school. Theme. What other? Give me a couple more. What? Text. Context. If we know that the word illustrate is on the academic word list, why don't we use that instead of draw? Let's illustrate our text. We can start to incorporate into our way of talking with kids the words that they're going to encounter as they go up through the grades. Other comments before I go on? So here's the criteria that I think you should use as you are looking at text that you are teaching kids or looking at the text you want kids to produce. How likely are kids to encounter or need to use a word in the future? And the amount of time you spend on it should be proportionate to that. So you're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, give me an example, mitochondria. Very specific to a unit, important enough, right? But I'm not going to spend more time on that than the word context or illustrate. Those words I want to be sure kids have in their working, useful vocabulary. So terms and purposes. If you start looking at text and taking them apart, you're going to see things like this. This doesn't quite match the slide that you have in your packet, but these are the kinds of sentences you'll see. So if you look at the first text example, given that the sum of two angles must equal 180 degrees, we can figure out the unknown angle by subtracting. Pretty common math text language. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1493, the overland spice trade to Europe was cut off. I want to look not just at vocabulary, but what structures do I see are used in the text that I also want to see my kids using. So in this case, it's dependent clauses. They need to know what happens when sentences begin with words like after, even though, as, because, before, and that there's a comma that accompanies that. Second column, Jose Maria Morelos, whose rebel army won some successes, was captured and executed in 1815. An exothermic reaction, which releases energy in the form of heat, has many practical applications. When you start looking at sentences at this level, you start seeing that children, students who are looking at text, reading or producing text in these areas, need to know how relative clauses work and the commas that accompany them. So when you're looking at academic language, it's not just vocabulary, it's language structures. This is, I'm about to show you a slide that is a quote from the front of a 10th grade textbook. And here's what it says. If cultures and civilizations are the tectonic plates of world history, frontiers are the places where they scrape against each other and cause convulsive change. Paraphrase that to your neighbors. You had to know something about geology and tectonic plates and how they come together. So there's some concept knowledge there. Yes?
You gotta know what an analogy is.
You need to know what an analogy is. Absolutely. What is the analogy? What is the relationship? Why are we talking about this on the front of this book? 10th grade world history. You need to know what some of the big ideas are that we're talking about in 10th grade world geography. All of this brings that academic language to the forefront. So I'm going to show you a text right now, and I actually do want you to take a second, or I'm going to give you maybe 3-4 minutes at your tables to first read it, and then work together at your tables to write it in academic language. So what you'll see is this is not written in academic language. I'll read it to you just so we all hear it. Jack Springer thinks that the government should allow people the right to own a gun, but I don't agree with him. People like him sort of think that the government limits our rights when it restricts gun stuff. They kind of think that most people who own guns are responsible guys who keep the guns for sport and recreation. They also think that the police are unable to stop violent crime and we need guns to protect ourselves. But I think he is wrong. I agree with Josephine Bluff, who thinks that guns increase the amount of violent crime in the community. I also think that human life is worth more than giving shooters the right to go shooting on the weekend. And I also think that many of the guns that are kept around the house would have ended up being used in violent domestic disputes or teenage suicides. Keeping the content. Rewrite this as a group at your tables using academic language. You have a few minutes to grapple at least in the first couple sentences. What kinds of things stood out that you have changed? Sort of, kind of. Okay. What advice would you give the student? This is not uncommon writing. Where do you go? What's the next step? What advice do you give the student? Is this a content issue or a language issue? This child is able to form an opinion, right? Has the content down, does not have the ways we would communicate it using academic language. Let me show you a second example. Same paragraph. Jack Springer maintains that the government should allow people the right to own a gun. This position asserts that the government is infringing on our democratic rights when it restricts gun ownership. Most people who own guns, so the argument goes, are responsible citizens who keep the guns for sport and recreation. It is further contended that the police are unable to stop violent crime and we need guns to protect ourselves. However, as Josephine Bluff states, guns increase the amount of violent crime in the community. Moreover, human life is worth more than giving shooters the right to go shooting on the weekend. In addition, many of the guns that are kept around the house are used in violent domestic disputes or teenage suicides. Much of that second paragraph is written exactly the way it was written in the first paragraph. And yet we know if you've got both these essays in your classroom, one would be appreciated a whole lot more than the other. So be thinking about that as you get kids turning in your work. There's not one way to do this. I put money on the fact that we didn't all write this exact paragraph, right? And you were all looking through the, not all, but many of you looking through the academic word lists and saying, oh, we could use this word here. Here's another word. That's great. That's what we need to teach our kids. Not that there's one way, but that there are many ways and some are just more appropriate than others. So it's not about content objectives here. It becomes about language objectives. That's where I want to go right now. So what is a language objective? A language objective states how students are going to be able to express what it is they've learned in English. As you're writing your plans, you need to be including both content objectives and language objectives. So the questions you ask yourselves as you write a language objective are, what are the language functions they need to access content learning? What are they going to do with the language? What language forms are students struggling with? What vocabulary and language structures are they struggling with that you need to teach to ensure they have access to the content? And what do you need to do so that they have opportunity to practice or that they have fluency? All of this is to get them to the next level. So these 3 F's, the F words, function, form, and fluency, should be a part of how you're thinking about academic language. Language objectives are the language demands of the content. So functions in school language are things like how do you define, describe, explain, classify, compare, summarize. That's the what. And you're always, when you write a language objective, going to have a what in there. What are students going to do with the language? It's academic vocabulary. Some of it's discipline specific. And it's also what structures. Do they need to know how to form a question appropriately? Do they need past tense? We looked at some writing recently where a student was trying to help her class to write about a routine, and yet she taught them the past tense. Yet routines are written in present tense. So try out what you're going to ask your students to do to really look at how you would answer it. Not how you think they would answer it, because we're often wrong. More times than not. Yes, sir?
So language objectives are the what?
I'm sorry, could you speak a little louder?
So which one is the what?
The what are the functions. What function are they going to use language? I'm going to show you some examples of functions in just a moment, and I think that will help make it a little bit clearer. Just another question to guide your thinking. What language do students need to complete the task? What is it they're going to do? What do you need to teach so that they can do it successfully? Not just the content, the language. So as you're looking at vocabulary, what things are you going to think about? Technical terms, concept words, labels, words or expressions they need to be able to discuss, to read, to write about the topic of the lesson. You may want to put up sentence frames, and I'll put some up in a minute so you can show how students can be guided to interact in more academic ways. Your vocabulary is going to be based on the determination on whether the vocabulary for the concept or the concept itself is unknown. That was that chart I showed you at the beginning. Do they know the language? Do they know the content? And which one do you need to emphasize? And you need to include ordinary language. Those first 1,000 words, as much as they're super common, they're sometimes harder to teach than the other words. It's a whole lot easier to teach skeleton than would, could, and should. Might and will. Those are tough. You can't just plop up an icon on the wall. So, language structures. What kind of spoken and written discourse patterns, such as questioning, verb tenses, are they going to need to use correctly in order to be successful in school? What do they need? What specific words or prefixes, suffixes, parts of words, morphology? What do you need to teach them so that they can be successful beyond this assignment to the next assignment? And how are you going to provide opportunity for practice? So, I am hoping, how many of you learned to write language objectives in your teacher ed program? Yay! So we won't spend a whole lot of time on this. I'm really, really glad to hear that. The 3 parts that every language objective should have in them are the language function, what are they going to do with it? A content stem. A content stem is what comes from your content standards. And what support are you going to provide so that they can be successful? 3 parts to every language objective. So, the student will list. The red here matches my red up here. That's my function. They're going to make a list. My content stem, a minimum of 3 reasons for characters' actions using a graphic organizer. The graphic organizer being the support. Some examples of functions. They are things like list, label, repeat, hypothesize, paraphrase. Again, it's the what are they going to do with the language to be successful. They're going to narrate, compose, summarize, defend, justify. Those are the kinds of words that will lead off your language objectives. Your content stem comes from your content standards. What is it you need to teach? The 3 states of matter. So they're going to describe the 3 states of matter using X, whatever that support is that you put in place specifically for language. And language supports look like this. There are things like real-life objects, manipulatives, pictures, photographs, illustrations, diagrams, color coding, dictating, etc. You learned all this, and that's part of what I said. I hope this is a little bit of repetition for you, but just to get it back in your mind as you're student teaching, as you're writing your plans, what content objective do I have? What language do kids need in order to be successful with it? Here's a couple more examples. Describe characteristics of insects and arachnids given pictures and sentence prompts. Again, language function, content support. Explain orally examples of symmetry in two-dimensional shapes from magazines. Describe the pull of magnets on classroom objects. Summarize the changes in ways of living in Colorado over time using a timeline. What I hope you see is that this goes across content areas. While you'll be doing the TPA in math and language arts, this applies to all areas of your day and whatever subject area you've specialized in. One more. Compare and contrast characteristics of insects and arachnids given a Venn diagram with aspects of comparison identified, multi-level books with visuals, and sentence prompts to write similarities and differences. It doesn't have to be one thing. What that is actually referring to is this. A Venn diagram is not just a Venn diagram, but off to the side says what each thing needs to be. Number one, what animal group does this, what phylum does it belong to? Characteristics of the phylum. What are the differences and similarities among their bodies, their appendages, their senses, etc. Then what? So you're going to consider the vocabulary and sentence structures, you're going to think aloud, you're going to model, you're going to do everything you can to provide opportunity for practice, really specific practice. Sometimes you focus on grammar more than the language support. So you may have something like the students will articulate the main ideas and details using target vocabulary, really specific. They're going to use main idea and detail. Students will describe a character's emotions using precise adjectives. Students will revise a persuasive paragraph using correct present and conditional verbs. Students will report a group consensus using citation verbs determined and concluded. If you are planning at this level, you will be super successful when it comes to the point that you are looking at what you've done to help kids be successful in terms of their academic language. I'm going to go through a couple of more examples real fast and then get you into a final activity. This is the difference between a content objective and a language objective. So the first is the student will identify the structure of the cell. The second are the language objectives. The student will explain to a partner the structure of a cell, and then there are some sentence frames. The blank consists of, the blank is made up of blank. The blank includes the, these are ways to structure language so that students can participate. The student will label cell parts on a diagram. The student will complete a closed text describing the structure of a cell. Those aren't content objectives, that's the language that they're going to need. Both plant cells and animal cells contain blank, etc., etc. And we're going to use whereas and however. I've got lots of examples. So sentence frames are really nice. You might do partner work where you've got sentence frames up. This is a partner A, partner B kind of sentence frame. So partner A, ask your partner to make comparisons. How are blank and blank alike? Once you've put this up there, it's up there. It goes with any content. It doesn't have to be for today's specific lesson. What other similarities do animal cells and vegetable cells have? What is the most significant similarity between animal cells and vegetable cells? Is there anything else that makes them similar? And partner B has answer structures, right? Both blank and blank are alike because like vegetable cells, animal cells have, etc. Ooh, that's, you know what, that right there can be really tricky. You put it up as a sentence frame and then sometimes the words we're using don't work. So you watch that because I've done it a lot in my classroom. But you get the idea. You put up talking frames, sentence frames. You can do compare and contrast paragraph frames. I've given you these examples in your handout, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But these are things that move across environments and will allow all students to participate better. But here's the thing. So here's character trait. A significant personality characteristic of, name the character, in whatever book, is that she was evil. The first incident where that character demonstrated evilness was, okay, the decisions are still being made by the student, but the ways of expressing them are being scaffolded for them. There are problem solution paragraph frames, but here's the thing, scaffolds need to go away. And I'm not sure we ever talk about that a whole lot. We talk a lot about putting scaffolds up, but eventually they need to come down. And so I just want to put up there to get you thinking about this idea that there are limitations. If they want to disagree and the only frame you've put up is about agreeance, we've got a problem. If they want to support a different kind of idea or add to it in new ways and all they have is that sentence frame, there's no way to deviate. And so sentence frames are great for a while, but eventually you need to get them to a place where they no longer need them. So what do students need? They need intensive and explicit instruction, they need opportunities to practice, and they need ongoing feedback. There is so much research out there on students who, after having gone all the way through a school year using an incorrect language structure, are asked, why do you keep saying that way? And when the kids hear that's incorrect, they say, the teacher never told me. They get really mad, really mad. It's our job to ease their learning burden. And we also need to help them move along. We don't want to be mean about it, but we do need to give feedback on how best to express ourselves. So one final thing I want you all to do before we leave today. You have a yellow sheet in front of you. I want you to look at the side called New Clothes. This is a 4th grade informal reading assessment from 2007. It's not terribly old. I want you to read through it, given all that we've talked about today, all the kinds of things you might look for in terms of language. And think about this. So I want you to read it, but I want you to consider what are the language needs, what words, phrases, and concepts might be misinterpreted. So literal versus figurative interpretations, words with double meanings, modals, idioms, tag verbs. What language will students need to be able to retell the story, including all the information required to demonstrate comprehension, and I'll read you those comprehension questions in a moment. What background knowledge and or schema are implied? How could you front load or structure the lesson to support student interaction with the text? What would your content objective be, and what would your language objective be? And here's what students need to be able to say when they retell the story in order to show that they are proficient. Who are the characters in the story? Where does the story mainly take place? Besides being the youngest, what is Bobby's biggest problem in the story? What did Bobby do to earn money? Besides hand-me-down clothes, what was one other thing that Bobby disliked about being the youngest? What does Bobby do at the end of the story? And what would be some words other than proud that would describe how Bobby felt on his first day of school? Why do you think Bobby's mother was even prouder? Okay, so I'm going to give you about 7 minutes to read through it, think through some of those questions. We'll share back a little. I'll give you some of my thoughts, and we set about 2 more minutes. My hopes in doing an activity like this is that you will begin to read differently and to think about what the implications for your teaching are. And so if we just look at that first paragraph, Bobby was the youngest member of his family. He didn't like being the youngest because he couldn't stay up late and watch television. Most of all, he disliked having to wear hand-me-down clothes from his brother. What kinds of things did you pull out of just that paragraph? Hand-me-downs. I use that example a lot outside of using this particular passage. There are all kinds of kids who know all 3 of those words. Down, me, and hand. They're pretty sure they know them very, very well. When put into this phrase with hyphens in between, they mean something completely different. So that's a big one. That's a big one both in vocabulary, but also in conceptually. What is a hand-me-down? What kinds of families have hand-me-downs? What are the cultural implications? The SES implications? There's a lot laden in that term alone. What else?
Stay up late.
Stay up late. Say more.
It's like I took that literally, like standing.
Mm-hmm.
Standing.
So that's that whole idea of tag verbs. So take on, take up, when the preposition that comes right after the verb gives it the meaning, we need to point that out to kids. And sometimes that can be the difference between a noun and a verb. Make up, make out. Okay, totally different meanings. And you have to see them together. So paying attention to that is super important. What else in that paragraph?
Dislike.
What's that?
Dislike.
Dislike. What a great opportunity to start looking at some powerful prefixes, right? So how else might we use dis? In what other, disappoint? I'm not going to think of other examples, but that's a really powerful thing to pull out to work on with kids because they're going to see it over and over. Remember that whole proportionality? That's something they're going to see a lot. I might spend a whole lot more time on dislike than on hand-me-down. Yes? Contractions, another one that we're going to want to point out, show how they work, and show that they work across text, not just in this text. Yes, sir?
Where?
Where, absolutely. Where can be interpreted a couple different ways. We need to be cognizant of these things. I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but here's the thing. While this may not have been a text that you would choose to work with your kids, this is an IRI. Kids are faced with these things every day. So as we're reading the text that we do choose, we need to give them the skills and strategies and vocabulary and structures to be able to talk about character. They need to know the word character. It's not in the text, but who are the characters in the story? That's a key vocabulary word, right? Because I'm a crazy woman, today at the end of the day, for no reason, I went back into this particular text. This thing's been done for days, right? Today I'm like, I wonder how those first 1,000, second 1,000 words play out on this particular text. So I looked up every word in this text. And it turned out that there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words in the second 1,000. About 2% of the words from this text, there were 294 words in it, came from the second 1,000. There were 2 words, or less than 1%, that came from academic. There were other words, depending on how you counted them, they accounted for between 5 and 9% of the text. 5% if you only counted Bobby as once, as opposed to the 7 times it showed up. Vice versa if you counted every instance. And everything else was the first 1,000 words. It's pretty powerful to know that we hold this in our hands in ways that we really can help students make magnificent leaps in their literacy and understanding just attending this. So this final thing is, to teach academic language, you need to be including language objectives. You need to provide language instruction. It's not enough just to expose kids. Kids need time to practice. They need feedback, and they need to be engaged. Do you have any questions for me? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I just can't hear you.
Can you leave that up?
Yes. Is this not in your slide packet? Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, I will leave this up. You will notice that on the white sheet on the first slide, contrary to what I showed you today, you do have my contact information. And I am happy to sit with you as you're thinking this through in your lesson plans or in your seminars. So feel free to contact me. I really appreciate you spending this much time on this. I know it is tough at the end of a day of teaching to come here and get your mind around something that isn't super, super concrete. But I think together we're going to make sense of it. I think the supervisors are very committed to it. We in the School of Education are very committed to it. And I think we're going to make great strides for children because we're attending to it. So thank you.